So I'm going to make a bit of an argument today, and I'll see how much you guys buy it. So that's sort of the thought. So I'm going to present little bits of data, and happy to talk more about anything because I'm like drawing little pieces out of studies. But here goes. So, because there has to be sort of a general intro, but you guys all know this, right? We view public information as really central to democracy. And yet we know from so many different analyses that have been done that people don't know a lot of the stuff that we think they should know if they're going to be good political actors, right? And so if they don't know this stuff, sort of the perennial question is, how in trouble are we? And to what extent should we be worrying about it, right? And so there's long been this line of research in political science and political communication, sort of, maybe this isn't a problem, and I'll give you a reason why, right? And the first sort of big thread of that is the heuristics literature. The claim is essentially individuals are picking up on low information cues that allow them to act more or less like they would act if they were indeed behaving rationally. The second sort of line of argument, which arguably has been quite dispelled by recent events, but we'll roll through it anyway, is that really what's going on is people don't need to pay attention most of the time because things are kind of okay no matter what way things go, unless it gets so bad that the proverbial burglar alarm goes off and then the media will somehow make all of us care, which they apparently have failed to do. So we're going to bracket that for the moment. And then finally, there's a line of argument that maybe people actually being directly informed about things isn't all that relevant because they're thermostatically responsive, right? Policy moves one way, they move the other way. And so the maybe small set of people who actually do know what's going on are enough to push things in the right direction, but things sort of won't get off track because of this process. But I think along with all of this is another crucial piece, which is that imagining an informed public as if that is some normative ideal is kind of silly. And the reason it's kind of silly is that if you want to think about a public that knows all the things that citizens are ostensibly supposed to know to be good democratic citizens, they would be spending all of their time finding out that information and none of their time behaving as human beings in society. And this is silly. Right. This particular case here, the Republicans rolled out a very large print, but still real printout of the entire Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. I'm sorry, it's 2010. I don't know why I have 2012 on the slides. That's wrong, but it's 2010 Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and that's how long it would be. And the idea that all the members of Congress were somehow supposed to read this and respond to it, let alone members of the public be knowledgeable about this kind of stuff is, I mean, absurd, right? And so we can't, I'm going to argue at least we can't work off of a model where the public is supposed to be truly fully informed. Okay, so this leads to sort of the question of like, okay, well, we may have these problems, but are we okay because these other processes are leading us in the right direction? I've made these intro-y slides a few years ago, and you can tell they're kind of dated by current events, but I think the point still stands, right? All right, so where I want to get us to today, and what's more specific, is this critical question of sort of, well, how do citizens actually make sense of the political information they encounter, right? And that is, we know they're not going to fully intake all the information that could potentially be relevant. They're going to use some of these different cues that we think of, and how are they going to make sense of things? And we've come, I think, in the literature to sort of two possible stories here. And I'm not sure they're mutually exclusive, but they're often portrayed as being. One is the ideal approach, that people go through the world and act as Bayesian updaters. They encounter information, they incorporate that information into their summary judgments in line with the importance of that information and what they already believed. And so they sort of are updating as they're going through the world. The sort of math of this, as it were, is that people are starting with prior beliefs, they're encountering some new piece of information, they're treating that as a likelihood, and they're updating their posteriors. Essentially, what's important about the Bayesian updating story is that if people are Bayesian updaters, we think of them as trying to reach accurate conclusions, right? That is their goal. They are accuracy-motivated individuals, and they're reaching those conclusions by integrating the new and old information they receive and reasonable, rational ways. I'm going to put rational in quotes because I'll come back to that point. The alternative approach that we hear about a lot right now is sort of the biased approach, for which motivated reasoning has become a bit of an umbrella, but which is a couple different sort of theories that all fall under that. And the basic idea there is that people's identity or initial preferences in some way, shape, or form is somehow influencing the way in which they either process encounter in the context of selective exposure, or process information in the case of biased processing, to end up with posteriors that are not based objectively on what they should come to based on the information they have. Right? That's the ostensible idea. And so people in this environment are, due to their identity or their preferences, and whether sort of consciously or not, focusing on particular goals that they're trying to reach in the information they gather and how they make sense of that information to come to the conclusions they get to. And so the important point of motivated reasoning, and where motivated reasoning as an idea really starts, if you go back to sort of Kunda and the initial theories, is this is goal-based processing. People are trying to reason their way toward particular objectives to reach particular goals, whether or not they're doing so consciously. So the usual question that we end up with at the end of the day, and I too have played in this particular sandbox a fair bit, right, is do people reach unbiased conclusions, or do they reach conclusions that correspond with their identity groups? And so to the extent that we see that people are reaching conclusions that in practice are bolstering their identity, aha, we say they must be engaging in biased processing. And that is the sort of typical logic of this particular view. And there are lots of times that we can do that. So we find that when, in some of our studies, when individuals are looking at polling data and they're evaluating the quality of polling data, polls that agree with them are less sensitive to sort of negative evaluations than polls that disagree with them, right? And so they evaluate quality in line with those judgments. When we see, for instance, that individuals who are Trump supporters tank in their evaluation or in their confidence in the 2020 election following the result, we say, aha, they're behaving as motivated individuals. This is because they want to reach that goal, because they don't want to believe the result that they got, right? This approach, I'm going to contend, reflects a critical misunderstanding. And that critical misunderstanding is the presumption that individuals who are, is premised on the fact that individuals who are acting rationally at an individual level can nonetheless reach biased conclusions. And so what I'm going to lay out is a couple of cases where I think that's clearly the case here, and try to make the argument that we should be looking for that the vast majority of the time. So I'm going to make sort of three principal contentions today. The first is rational actors are capable of reaching identity-based conclusions, right, without necessarily having identity-based goals in mind. The second thing I'm going to say is that this form of biased Bayesian updating does happen in practice, and I'm going to show you some evidence that that is indeed the case. And then I'm going to suggest at the end that this has some pretty important implications, both for the literature and for how we think about disseminating political information. So rational actors can reach identity-based conclusions. So first, the Bayesian story I told you, and the one that we typically think of, is incomplete. And it's incomplete because it's not just about prior and likelihood. It's also about how we weigh the evidence. When we see a particular piece of information or we make conclusions about something, we're evaluating two things at once. We are evaluating the evidence, and we're deciding how much, we're deciding sort of how to put that evidence into the overall story that we're putting together. And what I'll show you is that we actually use our priors in both of those. And so we're functionally double counting our priors a whole lot of the time. And so we can end up in a situation where, as we weight the prior and the likelihood relative to each other, and we figure out how to combine a whole bunch of likelihoods into summary judgments, because a lot of the time when we're making evaluations of information, we're not just making evaluations of one piece of information at a time, we can end up with posteriors that actually end up reinforcing our priors, or actually even stronger than our priors in diverging directions, depending on how we are making sense of that information along the way. And so Bayesian updating can then fall apart if people are using a biased subset of information to make decisions, and if they're processing the information that they receive in ways that give undue weight to new information, right? It can also fall apart, of course, if people are being motivated, but all of these exist, right? And there are going to be contexts where we see each of them, and I'm going to, again, show you some of them. So what are we talking about when we're thinking about people getting a biased subset of information? Well, if you think about sort of how the set of available information out there reaches you, there are a variety of steps at which that information ends up getting pared down. You don't need to necessarily go out seeking information in a biased way to end up with a biased set of information. I would contend, actually, the reason that scholars in the 1960s didn't really find a lot of evidence for selective exposure, and the reason we do now, is because the amount of information you can go out and find is just much, much broader. And there are a lot of forces that need, in practice, to pare that down before it gets to you. And those forces end up yielding information that may be, even if not completely homogeneous, more homogeneous, or at least biased in one way or another compared to the total available information scope, right? And so we can end up with sort of limited information there based on what we have. We also have cases where people are inappropriately weighting information, right? So, I showed you this sort of how important or how much credibility people put on different polls. This is a different where we give people one Republican and one Democratic poll, and we end up finding that Republicans say the Republican poll's more credible and Democrats say the Democratic poll's more credible when they have exactly the same credibility cues within, margins that anybody who ever looked at a survey would say are functionally equivalent. The weight that people are placing on that information is different. And again, we could have a motivated story here, or we could have a Bayesian story here, and I'll get you a little bit more to the Bayesian story in a sec. We also find that when we give people information about a fictitious officer-involved shooting in another study, and I'll show you some more data from this in a little bit, that people, when asked how important different pieces of information are selecting pieces of information that end up prizing their group more than pieces of information that aren't. And I'll show you how this actually ends up not necessarily being something that people are trying to do, but again, something they end up doing in practice. And so we end up then with these biased judgments that are in practice based on how they're evaluating the information. So here, Black Americans tend to be more likely to say in this fictitious officer-involved shooting that the officer should be charged. This is the Michael Brown case. We see Black Americans are more likely to say that Officer Wilson should be charged in Ferguson. We end up finding exactly the same thing in our sort of modeled replication of it, but where those kinds of conclusions end up being based on how people are weighting the information along the way. And then really, when we get to sort of systematic rejection of information, I'm going to skip through this essentially, but we do see that some people actually say about the scientific consensus on various issues, yeah, I know scientists believe this, but I don't think it's true. That's much more of a motivated case. That's where we can sort of distinctly say, yes, there's goal-oriented processing going on. People say scientists all think this and they're wrong, right? That's a different game. Okay. So where I want to get you to here is this topology of bias. And this is sort of something I've been playing with for a little while, but my argument is there are essentially two different ways you can end up with a biased conclusion. One is because you are goal-oriented, you are our proverbial motivated reasoning here, and the other is because of the social location in which you find yourself in. And again, both automatic and more considered processes can lead to biases in both of these cases. So when we think about acquisition of information, selective exposure is a case of goal-oriented, biased acquisition of information, right? That is the way to define what that is. You're going and you are seeking information designed to bolster a particular point of view. We also have varieties of incidental exposure or informational habits that can yield biased sets of information that people encounter, even if those individuals and sort of the active counter-arguing that's laid out in the motivated reasoning literature as ways that people can try to reach particular goals as they're processing information. But in the context of social location, heuristic cues can actually end up serving to bias processing as you think about what level of importance to put in a piece of information, and also these kinds of credibility judgments that I've been showing you, where people are trying to evaluate how credible one versus another piece of evidence is, how important it is, and how much weight to put on it. There too, what else seems reasonable, what's in the bounds of sort of what else you've been exposed to has the potential to yield bias. And when it comes to expression, again, goal orientation can operate either through processes like conformity or through something like expressive responding, but so too can social location, in the sense that social location can shape the salience of considerations that you're using to express a particular result, or the weighting of considerations. Okay, so does this happen in practice sort of becomes our second question, and I promise I'll speed up a little bit as we go. So how do we know this is happening? Well, we need to distinguish whether the information weight is leading to a conclusion or whether the goal is leading to both the information weight and the conclusion. The problem is, if all we know is the goal of information and goal or sort of motivation in one piece of information, we can't establish this. We can't establish the directionality. But the cool thing is most of our summary judgments don't actually depend on a single piece of information. They depend on a lot of pieces of information that we are aggregating. And in that context, we can start to evaluate this. So if you think about the model, here's what we're thinking about. We're thinking about these sort of two different ways that things might operate, right? Your identity might influence your summary judgment and thereby influence the assessments of how important different things are. Or your identity might influence the assessments of how important things are and via that influence your summary judgments, right? But the problem is, of course, these are observably indistinguishable, right? Again, if we only have that one piece of information on both. So how do we get around that? Well, I'm going to give you, I've already sort of said this, that if you link multiple pieces of information, we can start to get around it. So in a motivated reasoning context, we would expect that if we sort of give people multiple different statements that they're evaluating the importance of and look at how their summary judgments change, we might see that identity would influence your initial summary judgment. And then basically any information I give you beyond that initial summary judgment is going to not have much, if any, impact, right? Because you've essentially been given enough information to settle on the view you wanted to settle on, right? The other possibility, and we would see probably in this context, something like identity salience mediating the extent to which this happens. In the other context, right, we would expect to see that your identity would have a lot to do with what initial beliefs you had, and those initial beliefs would have an impact on the assessments of the importance of the various statements, but that as you were exposed to new statements, you would continue to update your judgments. Right? And so that's the sort of modeling difference we expect to observe here. There are two different ways I'm going to go at this. One is a simulation test where we look at an issue and we look at whether people's beliefs seem to be comprised of the pieces that we would expect them to be comprised of if they were indeed updating. And the second looks more at this sort of temporal piece that I just showed you. So the first context is the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. And here we asked people a series of questions about what they believed was part of the Affordable Care Act. So we asked them, and I'm showing you more data than I need to here. This has partisanship in it too. But we asked people whether they thought each of these 18 different provisions were in the Affordable Care Act, and then whether they liked them or not. And we also asked them how sure they were about whether they thought it was in or not in the Affordable Care Act. And if we're right about how this is working, what we should see is that summary judgments essentially operate as functionally a sum of the beliefs interacted with the confidence in those beliefs interacted with the favorability of those beliefs, and they may vary in importance as well. It turns out, of course, estimating this particular equation is a beast for various reasons, but it also doesn't really make sense because we think on a variety of levels that beliefs would have a relatively, that sort of the favorability of your beliefs would have a relatively consistent influence on your summary judgments, conditional on you using them at all. And so we ended up using a Bayesian model to simplify this a little bit, which is fun because we got to do a Bayesian model of Bayesianism. where what we ended up doing is saying there is a coefficient for belief, a coefficient for certainty, and a coefficient for favorability, and those coefficients vary as a linear function of whatever the importance of the thing is, right? And so we end up then with one term for each of these things for importance, and one term for each of the sort of parameters or interactions. And so we actually only have like 20 items in a model that does all of this for 18 belief items. And so we go through, we do that particular Bayesian process. There's too much text in this slide, so ignore it, right? And we end up with one of the items for, or sorry, 18 total items, one for each of the 18 beliefs, and then 7 interactions for favorability and an intercept. And just looking at the really interesting ones, which are, do you think something's in the law, right? So ignoring that sort of differential weight per different item, we see that actually it behaves just like we would expect here if people are operating as good Bayesians, right? It's not just that whether they think it's in the law or not in the law seems to have an impact, but the certainty seems to really make a big difference for how that works. So if you are confident that something is in the Affordable Care Act and you like the thing that's in the Affordable Care Act, you support the law more. If you're confident that something is not in the Affordable Care Act and you like the thing, you like it less, right? And vice versa, of course, right? Because these are linear parameters. So if you dislike it, those parameters would be reversed. And it's not really nearly as strongly true if you just say it's in the law, which would actually be what you'd expect to get the big coefficient if the primary direction here were motivational, right? So you wouldn't necessarily expect the certainty dimension to be influenced by motivation at all, and yet certainty is doing a lot of the work here. So again, it's sort of unlikely for this to align if people aren't using these in the Bayesian way we're proposing. Further, when we simulate an informed public doing this, and then we look at, say, how big partisan differences are before or after, we actually are able to account for more than half of the partisan differences in views of the Affordable Care Act from this kind of model, where it seems like people's favorability and the weights they put on things matter. So there's still a big partisan difference in the summary judgments, but more than half of the partisan difference in how people are evaluating this really politically polarized law ends up being related to how people are evaluating the individual components of it. So they seem to be acting like good Bayesians, even though they're still reaching a partisan conclusion, right? The leftmost set here is how big the Democrat-Republican divide is at the beginning. The rightmost is if we take out all the stuff related to, you know, how people are evaluating those beliefs. There's still a pretty big distinction between Democrats and Republicans, but it's not nearly as big as it was in the first place. So a lot of the partisan gap seems like it's actually a Bayesian partisan gap, as it were, where people are having these differences in their favorability assessments based on their partisanship, and that's playing its way through. Okay, probably even more solid evidence is thinking about how people are updating their information. So do people seem to update their beliefs with new information after they make an initial judgment? Or do they stick with their original judgments? In this particular case, we gave people a fictitious officer-involved shooting with 7 witness statements after the first 3 where they had enough information to make an initial assessment, even though all the statements were somewhat ambiguous. We asked them what their initial assessment was, and then we looked at whether they continued to update their information and their beliefs afterward. And so they're answering that same summary judgment question twice, in the middle and then at the end. We also had people who only answered it at the end, and they looked exactly like the people who answered it in the middle. It didn't seem to matter much in terms of, you know, influencing it. And here's what these statements looked like. It was like an involved scenario where people were reading a police statement. They loved this. They actually were really into this scenario. They gave us like long descriptive text responses to every single one of the things. And it was a broad national US sample, half black, half white in this case. Okay. So if we look at the judgments that people are making, right, we can look at the judgments they make if we predict the overall outcome from all statement weights, or if we predict the overall outcome as a function of the initial outcome, and then the statements between the initial outcome and the final outcome, right? So here's what we get if we look at whether people thought the officer's actions were appropriate using all the statement weights. And here's what we get if we control for the initial assessment and continue to look at whether they do it for time 2. We still get about half the effect. Right, so people still seem to be doing a ton of updating, even if we've already asked them to express their judgment, which in the survey world should solidify their judgment even more than if they were just motivated, yet we're still getting this kind of updating. Similarly, when we look at another outcome, we get the same thing, right? Anything that predicted at the beginning still matters to a decent degree, even when we control for that initial judgment. And so the evidence really suggests that people are continuing to update their beliefs a fair amount of the time. But in this case, we can really show it because we have Black and white Americans doing these evaluations of statements of this officer-involved shooting where they do reach very different conclusions. The weights they're putting on that information are very different, right? So they are updating in line with the evidence, and it's about half of the total relations, again, seem to really clearly fall into this mold. Further, the influence of race on statement weights. So if we look at respondents' self-reported race and what weight they place on the evidence is completely mediated by 2 things: perceptions of the criminal justice system and perceptions about Black people. And so we might think the identity is going to be doing the motivating work here, but instead we actually end up finding that what the identity is doing is the identity is very closely related to these 2 prior beliefs. And these prior beliefs in practice are the things that seem to shape the statement weights. And so we're wiping out the direct effect of race. We also tried manipulating racial salience, which doesn't do anything because you can't manipulate racial salience in the US, but that's another story. It's not that people weren't ever trying to do anything even a little bit motivated. We asked people do you want to read any of these additional witness statements? And we gave them a list of 7 that had a little sentence, right? And people did select toward things that were their group. So it wasn't like there was no motivation at all. But the bulk of it really seemed to be individuals operating in the sense where they were updating they were evaluating the importance of the various statements based on their priors. And obviously, if you're going to do that, you're going to end up with a biased view at the end of the day. And they did that, right? So this is entirely new information. Nobody's ever encountered this particular officer-involved shooting before, but they're reaching a conclusion that is bolstering their racial group, not because they're trying to, but because that seems more credible to them. Okay, so what are the implications of this? Well, the implications of this actually aren't all bad. They may in fact be pretty good in many respects. Because if this is our model, there's a clear intervention point, which is that we can try to work on people's prior beliefs or how they use those prior beliefs. And so if we can identify and target the sort of identity-informed prior beliefs, that may actually prove another leverage point for trying to think about reducing biased processing. And so we have an approach that we're working on at the moment under a Russell Sage Foundation grant toward doing this. We're looking at this particular case. We're trying to either give people, well, the first one didn't work. Intervention 1, objective information. I haven't written it up yet, but we gave people objective information about how often officers actually shoot white and Black people and how often what differences in criminality rates are according to victim surveys and other things like this to see if we could sort of equalize the information people had in the first place. We did succeed in convincing them of that, but they didn't seem to use that in their subsequent judgments. So we're wondering if by giving them this new information, we made them actually weight that information less. But there are a few questions that we're playing with. There are also ways to think about sort of trying to say, okay, there's been a bunch of work in political science recently saying, what if you try to convince people to sort of think about the perspectives of the different actors? What's that really doing in practice? Well, it's giving people reasons not to use their priors as the basis for evaluating information, but trying to use the evidence that's in front of them more directly, right? So anything we can do to potentially segment the influence of the priors on the evaluations has the potential to reduce that bias. And so we're trying that, and we're also trying just because we have to mitigating racial bias directly, even though the data is not so strong on that because we think it's important to test. But the argument is there should be ways to actually use this in our interventions rather than just assuming that people must be motivated and we need to challenge the motivation directly. So my suggestion then, or my argument is, please consider social location. It probably matters a lot in a lot of these circumstances. Maybe it's just my feeling of general goodwill toward humanity, but I don't think most people are trying to be biased processors most of the time. Right, I think the data sort of backs that up, that a lot of the time they end up being biased processors because they're evaluating the credibility of the information that they're encountering, and they're then using those same priors again to influence how to combine that information into a summary judgment, and thus reinforcing their priors by trying to be good Bayesians. And the question is, can we help them actually be better Bayesians there? And I think we probably can, but it's not the approach we've been taking so far. So that is my argument. Whole boatload of collaborators to thank there, and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was a very fascinating presentation. So we'll open the floor for questions, and I actually have one to start. So I was thinking about this kind of information processing when it comes to the context you gave, and specifically with Black Americans. Mm-hmm. And I guess I just wonder how you can expect a disenfranchised group, for example, when you're using such an emotionally charged topic, right? Yeah. People who experience that discrimination might have a hypervigilance around these things. So how do you account for, have you considered accounting for this kind of nervous state or emotional factors?
So we're not accounting for emotion directly in any of this. Our goal, as we've seen it, right? I think a priori, our expectation is that whites have a lot more misinformation in this particular, or have a lot less information to work off of in this particular vein than blacks. And we think that our interventions are going to have larger effects on white Americans than Black Americans. We're running it on both because on a theoretical level, our goal is to mitigate the differences in the priors, not to make normative claims about who's right and who's wrong and what the objective value of the truth should be. Because I think that's messier in a variety of respects and makes the results of the work more overtly political in a way where it's more helpful to say, no, the goal is just, when we're, putting this out for funding, our thoughts on it are like, if you have a situation where people are coming in with different priors and they're then evaluating it in the context of a jury, the people who are on that jury are structurally unlikely to reach a unanimous conclusion because those priors are going to lead them to interpret this information in diverging ways. And so if that's the problematic line, there's no who's right and who's wrong that we're imposing on it to potentially try to address the issue. And so it's less likely to sort of run into well, you're trying to make X partisan case or whatever, right? Even though I think we're pretty convinced that Black Americans have a much better sense of what Black Americans' interactions with the police look like than white Americans do. And that, is obviously a driving motivator for us.
That's a good clarification. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, you were sort of going on the intervention strategies on prior beliefs in the end, or you said objective information, just providing objective information didn't really work, which to me intuitively makes sense. When I have a prior belief and you give me 3 sentences, I'm not going to update all my prior beliefs. You then said something like a perspective-taking intervention, but they haven't always been successful either. So what are the chances here? It makes perfect sense, but how are we going to update prior beliefs?
To me, this is the big question at this point, right? I think thinking about how do we get people to enter a scenario where they're not letting their priors do this multiple times is the real substantive piece. Some of the racial intervention training does try to do this, and we're trying to use that in that intervention as well, where we're basically saying, hey, think about how these things might end up playing an influence. But the data, I mean, the data is not strong on any intervention here, right? It just hasn't been. But I think part of a lot of sort of the strategies that have been used have in practice either been deficit model strategies, which definitively don't work, right? Or strategies that are really focused on sort of calling people out for their motivation, which also is likely to induce backlash and probably won't work. And if I'm right that a lot of the time people aren't actually doing it for goal-oriented reasons, when they self-search, they're not going to find that, right? They're going to say, well, yeah, but this is the truth, right? And so the problem, I think, is figuring out how, in some larger scale, to think about that updating or that prior building process, really, in a way that's going to render things less biased, or in thinking about ways to sort of highlight what people should be applying to a particular scenario in ways that'll do that. I'm hoping the jury case will be nice in that respect, because there are good normative reasons to ask a jury to divorce themselves from their prior expectations. But that may be harder to do in a lot of political contexts, right? So I don't fully have answers here, right? But I think the direction is different. I think it's a very different way than thinking about these people are motivated and they're it's hopefully less defeatist.
Thanks, Josh. This is great. And I have a question about the statistic model, or sort of the table. Yeah, this one.
Yes, this is me. So please critique this.
No,
I've been kind of excited about this,
yeah, no,
but
I am.
I haven't. Nobody's killed it yet, which is good.
Nice.
But
my question is the following: in light of some of the work on tracking what information people consume, which of the paths do you think is the most likely for the average citizen to be in? I
mean, I think we're in most of these boxes at once in practice, right? This is like my own larger theory of things. I think most social science theories are true. The question is how much of the world they explain. My argument is just, I think this explains more than we tend to give it credit, right? That we tend to want to think this is what's going on when we see bias, and this can be what's going on, and I think is, even in some pretty politically salient cases, a large portion of the time, right? So that's more my thrust here. I think people are selectively exposing themselves to a decent degree, but I also think they're embedded in networks where they're seeing things that are reinforcing some of that, right? I don't, the echo chamber literature suggests that's not really what's happening for many people. Save, at least in the US, a very small proportion on the right do get it. But if your information habits have you going to Fox News, right, because that's what all your friends use, not because you're trying to reach a particular political conclusion, you're still going to reach the Fox News conclusion. And it's kind of hard, it's going to be hard to disentangle the extent to which that's goal-oriented versus social location-oriented based just on trace data, right? I mean, I guess what we could say is this is based on habits, and then, we could take particular cases like, the Hunter Biden laptop thing, right? You guys are all aware of the Hunter Biden wacky laptop story where, nobody believed it at first, and then it turned out he really did leave his laptop in this, random computer shop that gave it to Rudy Giuliani. It's so silly. But it's like a perfect, weird politics case. But the Hunter Biden laptop story, a lot of media dismissed it sort of out of the bat at first. Who was willing to accept it when varied in ways that might not have that much to do with what people wanted to believe, but may have had more to do with, when reporters started realizing that actually this was not complete baloney, right? Those kinds of incidents and the effects of them, to the extent that we could actually measure them, might give us some insight into that. But Like, it's hard. There's not clean points where you can say, oh, this person was clearly looking for this and this one clearly wasn't outside of experiments, right? In the case of the racial scenario that I was presenting some of here, we did give people that list of options of things to click on, right? That's a clear selective exposure case because they're choosing what options based on one sentence they think are worth reading in diverging ways based on what group they're on, right? That's different from, well, I just happen to see this because I'm a person who happens, who goes to X thing because all my friends do. So yeah, it's hard to tease a lot of it out in many cases. Like, we have to do experimental work and look at marginal things, sadly. Yeah.
I have 2 points, but first let me give you some feedback on this table, since you wanted it. Really a little bit confused here as to what is the scope of this table. What are we supposed to take from this? Is this supposed to cover all sorts of modes of acquisition we as humans have in terms of information?
So I mean, this is really an attempt to sort of take a series of theories that we've been batting around in the political communication world, and political psychology world, and to figure out how they fall with respect to why people are reaching biased conclusions. So it's kind of narrowly tailored toward that.
So, but if I take this selective exposure cell,
right?
How do I go from selective exposure to counter-argument?
So this is not procedurally what happens.
Okay.
This is when you're acquiring information, how can that lead to bias? So the question here in every cell is how could this potentially lead to bias, right? And my claim is either automatically or in a more considered way, you could be selectively exposing yourselves to particular sites, and that downstream of that, you will have bias regardless of what has happened elsewhere. That, if you're counter-arguing, regardless of what information you've gotten, if you're engaging in an active cognitive counter-arguing process with a piece of information that you have encountered, that is a biasing process, that is a goal-oriented biasing process that will yield a biased conclusion at the end of the day. So that is the way I think of this as working, if that makes sense. This is just to sort of imply people are acquiring information first, then they're processing it, then they're expressing it. But I could take away those arrows. That might be bad.
Selectively exposed,
Nope.
They're going to counter-argue.
Manage software center? Weird. Who knows? Yeah.
I'm wondering how different selective exposure and information habits are from each other. Seeing you go into the selective, like giving an example for selective exposure, I would think that you could consider that as an information habit as well. Do you think you can disentangle them, or are they really that similar to each other?
They're hard. They're clearly hard to disentangle, right? The question at the end of the day is, sorry, let me minimize this so we can see the whole thing, is why, right? No, why are people doing what they're doing, right? So if they're doing what they're doing because they are seeking a particular goal, then the theory actually posits a why, right? The theory of selective exposure, I would contend, says people are choosing into information sites with the either implicit or explicit goal of reaching particular conclusions. Information habits here says you might be right that that's happening, but it's also possible that people are encountering those same sites much of the time for reasons that have nothing to do with trying to reach particular goals, but instead have to do with who they're surrounded by and what's normative in that group. And in that respect, they generate a series of habits that lead them to encounter information that will still be biasing in similar ways downstream, but where there was not an active goal to do that. And that may imply, for instance, that if one were to help people, if somebody has problematic information habits, they may be open to an intervention that says, hey, your habits are actually leading you to weird information. And if you did X, Y, and Z, you'd get a more balanced set of information or something. There are reasons I don't love the idea of information balance, but just for the moment, I'll put that there. Whereas somebody who is engaging in it for the purpose of reaching a particular goal would never be, amenable to that argument, because why would they change what they're doing? They're getting what they want.
Okay, so one follow-up. How would you then consider researching the interaction of goal orientation and social location? So if due to my information habits, have a certain social location, does that at some point shape my goal orientation?
I think that's an excellent question. It's probably true, right, that you end up with loops here and that these cross over in some ways. But I'm trying as much as possible to say, on a theoretical level, what are people trying to do and where are they getting? And I think the sort of larger, 30,000-foot argument here is we've forgotten that accuracy motivation doesn't equal accuracy. And that is a problem, because accuracy motivation doesn't mean anything about whether you actually reach accurate conclusions, because you can be as good a Bayesian as you want to be and really integrate this information in excellent ways and still screw up in parts of it because of other forces that surround you.
Yeah, I also have a question. In your approach, how do you differentiate between attitudes or like the more subjective beliefs and how people acquire, process, and express information that are based on objective facts and figures?
Theoretically, I don't think they're different, right? I think whether we can objectively test if something is true or not true is independent of its status as a belief, right? So there clearly are things that are entirely attitudinal, right? I come from the school of psychology that views an attitude as a like or dislike toward a particular object, right? And so when I think of what's going on attitudinally here, an attitude may be a product of a series of beliefs, or may be influenced by a series of beliefs, or may also be influenced by a hot cognitive response to something else that's going on that one imputes upon some particular idea or something else, but that all of that in practice is about the sort of, of lean in, lean out type response to a particular thing that is more attitudinal. Whereas I think of the belief as how one regards a particular piece of information. And in a number of ways, beliefs feel to me more tractable, even if those beliefs can't be directly verified or not.
Matthias, and then Barrett. Matthias, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question as well, yeah.
Okay, and then was there one over here?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go you.
Thanks. I have a question about the distinction you made between, on the one hand, Bayesian updating, and the other hand, bias processing. You already asked the question from the beginning a little bit, to what extent they are mutually exclusive. But I sensed throughout your presentation that Bayesian updating is the good way to process information, and the other one is the biased one.
I started with that as the normal framework, right? And I think they're on a philosophical level, and tell me if you want to add more here, but on a philosophical level, a Bayesian updating system is ostensibly the right way to make sense of information. So if I gave you information that you didn't, that you had no priors on at all, right? And you slowly took in each piece of information, came to some evaluation of that piece of information, came to a judgment, added the next piece, et cetera, whether you're doing that in an online or a memory-based way, if you're properly allocating the weight to pieces of information and properly aggregating those weights and those pieces of information into summary judgments, you would reach what we would theoretically deem the normative ideal view for you, right? And that's the view that reflects your considered opinions drawn through the information that exists. That I think is the basic notion there. Now, where I jump to from that is that, well, actually, because of priors, and because you can be doing that off of priors, and because you can count those priors multiple times in the process, that needn't be rational at all, or that needn't yield a truly unbiased result at all. But it is, at least as I understand it, the only philosophical model of a rational updating process given a breadth of information.
And my question would then be, so even if Bayesian updating can lead to biased conclusions, right? But can biased processing also be part of Bayesian updating? Because what Bayesian updating also means, right, is that you have priors, that you get new information, and depending on your priors, depending on the source it comes from, depending on the weights, you adopt it. But you could theoretically also move into the opposite direction, for instance. Would that still, that would be biased processing, but couldn't that also fall under the category of Bayesian processing?
That's kind of the point. Yes,
yeah.
is that's exactly right, and that we tend to think the initial assumption we make is, oh, if I just went out there and I kept giving you all the pieces of information you could possibly have on this topic, that by the time I gave you and anybody else in the world those pieces of information, and you thought about them and you came to a considered opinion on them, you would reach the same exact conclusion. And in large part, my answer is actually no. That's a fallacious line of thinking, because there is enough already inside of you that you could end up reaching completely different conclusions, even with the same new information based on your starting points. And so, yes, exactly.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I've got 3 questions. Well, the first is you have, of course, around the table. Just one question. I don't know what it has already been asked, but I was really wondering, selective exposure, why is it looks like you link it only to goal orientation? Whereas my question is, why isn't it located to social location? For instance, if I live in a certain neighborhood, I'm also selectively exposed to certain information.
So this is definitional, right? I think selective exposure can be defined either way. I think it's much more helpful to define selective exposure in a way that deals with motivation. So I think there's been some disagreement in the literature. It hasn't been hashed out to nearly the level it should be. But I think of selective exposure as an active process, not a passive process. Whereas I think of information habits and incidental exposure as passive processes, where the person is exposed to different things, not because of their own volition. Whereas I think selective exposure in its original theoretical intent, and I think it really needs to hold, otherwise I don't know what selective exposure is, to be honest, has to be about motivation. And this is another case where I think people have been really fuzzy. So I think this tendency to like lump every form of biased processing under motivated reasoning, I don't think is particularly helpful too, because whether people have those goals or not is really, really important to what we do about it and how we understand it. And yet we tend to sort of say, oh, we look at the results of the data and we bin it based on whether there's bias or not why there's bias. And indeed, much of the data is completely consistent with people selectively exposing themselves in this way, or having information habits that yield the same basic result. But the why is different, and the difference in that why has a substantive difference in how one would ever think to address it, is my argument.
Well, I'm a layman, of course, on this topic, and just by intuition, I thought it's also a passive process, right? That you are selectively exposed. But then I have 2 other questions. 4-way direction model, it's extremely problematic, of course, and I'm not very knowledgeable about your Bayesian strategy, but I was wondering, the 4 variables, they seem related to one another to me. So they seem very endogenous, and I was wondering, is that a problem?
So in the Bayesian model, no. There's one coefficient. So while there are a bunch of interactions in there, the way that things are set up to work is that coefficient is defined across every single, do we have a whiteboard here? I'm not sure you want me to go into how this thing works, but basically if you thought about how the basic thing would work, right? What you do is you'd have sort of beta 1 belief, right? Times, or sorry, beta 1 belief sub I, beta 2 belief, or sorry, certainty sub I, right? So you do this for every single one. If you did that, what you'd end up with is a model that's highly multicollinear, and all of these being related to each other gets to be a really big problem, and you end up with estimates that can go all over the place based on minor differences. Instead, what we did is we actually said, no. There's actually only one coefficient on belief, but the coefficient on belief is also multiplied by an importance of the parameter. And by doing that, which is what the Bayesian model allows us to do, it allows us to constrain those to be the same thing. So it's estimating 18 distinct belief coefficients at the same time based on a global belief coefficient multiplied by an importance parameter. And so by doing that and putting that into the model, you're able to end up with a much more consistent estimator of what's going on there. And there's no potential that these flip back and forth directionally from one item to the next item, which is the big problem that ends up leading to highly variable estimates there. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, well, I would need to read up on it, but it sounds.
Yeah, I can send you the draft, or actually the student's dissertation that this was in the draft of the paper. But it's like we're.
Do so. And then my final question is, as I understood the presentation, your main takeaway is that people are able to update their priors in response to information, and that it's a positive thing. But I was wondering, what does it mean to update your priors? You came up with, with the case of race in the US, and did all the updating have a positive effect? Did whites become more favorable of colored people, or can you tell anything about the way in which priors were updated?
So people, the updating our priors that we succeeded at is people believed us on the specific matters that we updated them on, and they remembered that a week and a half later, which was something. The problem is it didn't seem to spill into these other judgments. And so the substantive question that we're wrestling with on that particular project is, why didn't it spill into the other judgments? Right, so we know we can successfully update these priors. But the problem is those priors seem to be less related to the subsequent judgments when we update them. Meaning, my current takeaway, and again, we haven't done the analysis for this, so be really cautious with this one. But my guess as to what's going on is that when we give people new information on those priors, those updated priors don't have the same level of centrality to how people are making their judgments on the weights of the different piece of information as we move forward. And so what happens is you give people an updated prior, and essentially the internal news that I just updated this prior and that it's not something that I've been holding on to for a while is a weight diminisher for the prior. And so we can't then subsequently expect that to be used because it doesn't have weight within the constellation of things that people are using to make their determinations of the value of the new information. Not sure what to do with that at this point, but that is my guess as to what we're observing. And it is very much a guess because it's hard to test. But that is sort of the next thing we need to figure out is what is it that is happening when people are in fact, taking our information, accepting it, spitting it back to us more than a week later. So it's not like it's something that was like ephemeral, but not actually using it in the judgments that they seem to be making based on it in every other manner that we can assess it. And so, yeah, that's where we are in the project right now.
I think we have time for one quick question. You had one here?
Yeah, thanks. You talked a lot about the prior beliefs. I was wondering if you have built in kind of types of prior beliefs, because some prior beliefs just because what I look like, what I don't want, I'm white, that kind of stuff. But I also have prior beliefs because I followed a specific type of education and I had specific type of friends. And some I attribute more value to, and some are guiding me more or to a larger extent than other prior beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's almost certainly right. I think that is a question that is going to be very topically dependent, right? So I think we felt fairly confident as we were evaluating the racial case that we were working with here that sort of generalized racial attitudes and that perceptions of police fairness were relatively proximal prior beliefs, right? They fit pretty nicely, and they did this work of sort of mediating fully the relations between racial self-identification and how people were evaluating these statements. What would do that in other circumstances, I think, is going to depend on the issue at hand. And I think it's an important empirical question. And so a lot of this may need to be multi-stage work to try to piece out. That'd be my contention, at least.
How did you test again?
So we put a series of batteries on of things that we thought, in this case, we were originally looking for racially motivated reasoning, right? We thought that was what we were going to find. We did not find that, right? We found it, but weakly, right? And so we did things like try to manipulate racial salience or ask people how important their race was and treat those as mediators of the process. And what we ended up finding was the evidence that I showed you here, where the new information seemed to continually build after people had rendered an initial judgment, and where what seemed to be the most critical thing for not only the judgments that people were making at the end of the day, but also the weight they were putting on the information, were those facets of racial attitudes and perceptions of police fairness. We also asked about a bunch of other sort of related to race concepts that we thought might be relevant, like linked fate, that didn't seem to matter all that much. Those were, nicely for us, at least in terms of understanding things, both theoretically proximal, right, and things that we clearly had there and we could show they worked. What would exist in other circumstances gets tougher. One of the nice things about race in this context is that race is not particularly mutable. People don't go around changing their racial self-identification all the time. There's a little bit, but very little, right? And because of that, we don't need to sort of think of it as like, oh, well, we've got partisanship, which can shift, and then that we're trying to understand what the thing, right? We're trying to simplify this process, right? It's complicated. There's a lot of pieces here.